Keanu Reeves walked into the supermarket, blending seamlessly with the evening crowd, his unassuming demeanor masking the hero within. But tonight wasn't going to be a quiet errand. Near the exit, a young boy clutching a worn paperback was being cornered by a towering security guard. "Got your red hand, huh?" the guard barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the store. The boy stammered, his face pale, as whispers rippled through the growing crowd. Keanu's sharp gaze locked onto the scene, the boy's trembling hands, the fear in his eyes. This wasn't the face of guilt. It was the face of someone crushed by judgment. What Keanu did next would not only expose the truth, but transform the boy's life in ways no one could have predicted. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. It was a quiet evening in downtown Los Angeles. The glow of neon signs illuminated the rain-slicked streets, casting a soft shimmer that danced on the pavement. Inside a bustling supermarket, customers hurried down aisles, pushing carts filled with groceries, their faces etched with exhaustion from the day. Among them, unnoticed at first, was Keanu Reeves. Dressed in his usual understated style, faded jeans, a plain black hoodie, and scuffed boots, he moved quietly through the store, scanning shelves for a few essentials. Keanu wasn't there to draw attention, he rarely was. Yet, even in his unassuming manner, there was a calm presence about him that seemed to bring a sense of quiet to the chaos around him. As he reached for a loaf of bread, a commotion near the store's entrance caught his attention. A young boy, no older than 16, stood frozen in place near the exit. His face was pale, his hands gripping a worn paperback book so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Across from him loomed a burly security guard, his voice loud and accusing. "You think you can just walk out of here without paying?" the guard barked, his tone dripping with authority. The boy stammered, his words barely audible. I didn't steal anything. I was looking at the book." "You were looking at it outside of the aisle, kid. That's stealing," the guard shot back, stepping closer, his broad shoulders towering over the boy's slight frame. A small crowd began to gather, curious shoppers craning their necks to see what was happening. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "What did he do? Probably stole something. Kids these days." Keanu set down his basket and began walking toward the scene. His expression was calm, but his eyes sharpened with quiet intensity. As he approached, he noticed the boy's worn sneakers, the frayed edges of his jeans, and the way he clutched the book, a paperback copy of a classic novel, its pages dog-eared and spine cracked. This wasn't the look of someone trying to make a profit. This was a boy who simply loved books. The guard jabbed a finger toward the boy's chest. "You've got two choices. Hand over the book or I call the cops." The boy's lips quivered. "Please, sir, I didn't take it. I didn't have time to put it back on the shelf." "That's enough," the guard snapped, reaching for the boy's arm. That was when Keanu stepped in. His voice was steady but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite yet commanding. "What seems to be the problem here?" The guard turned, his irritation evident. "This kid tried to walk out with merchandise. Store policy is zero tolerance." Keanu's calm gaze met the guard's. "Did you see him steal it? Or are you just assuming?" The guard hesitated. "I didn't see it, but he was near the exit with the book." "That's not the same as stealing," Keanu replied evenly. His voice was measured, yet there was a quiet authority in it that made the crowd fall silent. He turned to the boy, his expression softening. "What's your name?" The boy looked up at Keanu, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Trevor?" he said quietly. "Trevor," Keanu said gently. "Did you take this book without paying?" Trevor shook his head vigorously. "No, sir, I was just reading it. I didn't have the money to buy it, but I wasn't going to take it." Keanu nodded, then turned back to the guard. "Have you checked the security cameras?" The guard bristled. "I don't need cameras to see what's obvious." Keanu's jaw tightened ever so slightly, though his tone remained calm. If it's so obvious, then checking the cameras shouldn't be a problem, should it? The crowd, now fully invested in the scene, murmured in agreement. The guard hesitated, looking at the expectant faces around him. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he muttered, "Fine, let's check the tapes." As the guard marched off, Keanu placed a reassuring hand on Trevor's shoulder. "Don't worry, kid," he said with a small, encouraging smile. "The truth has a way of coming out." Trevor nodded, though tears brimmed in his eyes. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope. Trevor had always been a dreamer. Growing up in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, he found his escape in books. His room was modest, a creaky twin bed, peeling wallpaper, and a single wobbly bookshelf that he'd salvaged from a dumpster. The shelf, though barely standing, was his most prized possession. On it were battered paperbacks he'd collected over the years from secondhand shops, library giveaways, and, occasionally, kind strangers who noticed the spark in his eyes when he talked about his favorite authors. Trevor's love for reading wasn't just a hobby, it was a lifeline. His mother, a single parent, worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. Life had been a constant struggle since his father walked out when Trevor was just 6 years old. While his mother did everything she could to provide for him, there were no extra pennies for luxuries like new books. Instead, Trevor spent hours in the library, devouring every story he could get his hands on. But the books he truly wanted to own, ones that spoke to his soul, were out of reach. The supermarket where tonight's incident occurred had become his secret haven. In the back corner of the store was a modest book section stocked with classics, bestsellers, and paperbacks that rotated weekly. Trevor would stop by whenever he could, walking 2 miles from school just to spend a few quiet moments there. The store employees often turned a blind eye as he sat on the cold tile floor, flipping through the pages of novels that transported him to faraway lands. But not everyone was so understanding. Frank, the security guard, had been working at the store for almost a decade. Gruff and impatient, he prided himself on being a stickler for rules. To Frank, Trevor was just another troublemaker, a kid who lingered too long in the aisles and clearly didn't belong in a store frequented by middle-class families. Frank's suspicions were further fueled by Trevor's worn sneakers, patched-up backpack, and the faint smudges of ink on his fingertips, remnants of his habit of jotting down story ideas whenever inspiration struck. It wasn't the first time Frank had confronted Trevor. A month earlier, Frank had caught him reading in the aisle and barked, "If you're not buying, you're loitering, move along." Trevor had apologized and left, his cheeks burning with humiliation. But he couldn't stay away. The pull of the stories was too strong. Tonight, Trevor hadn't intended to cause trouble. He had come straight from school, still wearing his tattered uniform with a crumpled $5 bill in his pocket, money he had saved from skipping lunch for 3 days. He'd hoped it would be enough to buy the book he'd been eyeing, a well-worn copy of The Catcher in the Rye. As he picked it up, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The weight of the book in his hands, the texture of its pages, and the faint smell of ink were a comfort he couldn't explain. He wasn't thinking about the disapproving stares of shoppers or Frank's watchful gaze from the security counter. All he could think about was how the story inside those pages might help him make sense of his own life. But when he glanced at the price tag, his heart sank. The book cost $7.99, just out of reach. He sighed, his fingers lingering on the cover, and turned toward the aisle to put it back. That was when Frank appeared. From Frank's perspective, the scene was clear, a scruffy kid near the exit with a book in hand. He didn't bother to ask questions. In his mind, Trevor was guilty before proven innocent. "You've been hanging around here too much," Frank had said sharply, stepping between Trevor and the aisle. "This isn't a library, kid." "I wasn't stealing," Trevor had protested, but his voice was shaky, and the nervous look in his eyes only seemed to confirm Frank's suspicions. By the time Keanu intervened, Trevor's mind was racing with panic. He wasn't just afraid of being accused of something he didn't do. He was terrified of how his mother would react. She had enough to worry about without him adding to her stress. The idea of her receiving a phone call about her son being detained at a store made his stomach twist with guilt and shame. As Trevor stood there, clutching the book, he thought about all the things he'd wanted to say to Frank but couldn't. He wanted to tell him that he wasn't some thief looking for a quick score. He was just a kid trying to hold on to a dream. trying to find a bit of hope in a world that seemed to offer him so little. And then Keanu appeared, his calm yet commanding presence silencing the chaos. For the first time that evening, Trevor felt a glimmer of hope. Frank led the way to the store's back office, muttering under his breath as the crowd slowly began to disperse. Trevor trailed behind, his head hanging low, the paperback still clutched tightly in his hand. Keanu walked beside him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Trevor's chest. The boy felt a mix of humiliation, fear, and gratitude. He didn't know who this man was, but the fact that someone, anyone, was willing to stand up for him felt like a lifeline. As they entered the cramped office, Frank gestured toward a chair. "Sit!" he barked at Trevor, who obeyed without question. The security monitors on the wall displayed grainy footage of the aisles, shoppers moving like shadows through the store. Frank planted himself in front of the monitors, scrolling through the footage with practiced impatience. Keanu leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "Take your time," he said evenly, his voice carrying a subtle hint of irony that Frank either missed or ignored. Trevor sat quietly, his hands trembling as he placed the book on the desk. He didn't dare say anything, afraid it might make things worse. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional click of the mouse as Frank rewound and fast-forwarded the footage. Finally, he stopped, jabbing a finger at the screen. "There! See? He's holding the book by the exit." Keanu stepped forward, narrowing his eyes at the screen. The footage showed Trevor standing near the checkout area, the book in his hand, his gaze fixed on the floor as though lost in thought. Keanu's sharp eyes caught something Frank seemed determined to overlook. "That's it?" Keanu asked, his tone deliberately measured. Frank turned, his expression smug. "That's all I need. He was by the exit with unpaid merchandise. Store policy says—" Keanu cut him off, his voice still calm but now tinged with steel. "Store policy also says you need actual proof. Did you see him try to leave with the book? Did he hide it in his bag? Did he run?" Frank hesitated, his bluster faltering. "Well, no, but it's obvious what he was doing. Look at him!" Keanu's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "Look at him? What exactly are you looking at, Frank?" Trevor's head shot up at the sound of Keanu's voice, and for the first time he saw the flash of anger in the man's eyes. It wasn't the loud, explosive kind of anger that Trevor had seen in his life before. It was quiet, restrained, and infinitely more powerful. Frank folded his arms, his face flushing with frustration. "Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but I've been working here long enough to know a thief when I see one." Keanu straightened, his presence suddenly seeming much larger in the small room. "And I've been around long enough to know what it looks like when someone's being judged unfairly. All I see here is a kid holding a book." He paused, his voice softening as he turned to Trevor. "Why don't you tell us what happened?" Trevor swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced nervously at Frank, then back at Keanu. I was just reading," he said quietly. "I didn't have enough money to buy it, but I wasn't going to steal it, I swear. I was going to put it back, but he gestured weakly toward Frank, his voice faltering. Keanu nodded, his gaze never leaving Trevor's face. "It's okay, Trevor. Just tell the truth." Trevor's voice grew steadier, as though Keanu's calm was rubbing off on him. "I just wanted to look at it for a little longer, that's all." Frank let out a harsh laugh. "Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that?" Keanu turned back to Frank, his voice low and firm. "You don't have to believe it. That's why you have cameras, right? To find the truth." Frank opened his mouth to retort, but a knock at the door interrupted him. The store manager, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped inside. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her gaze shifting between Frank, Keanu, and Trevor. Frank puffed out his chest, eager to defend his position. "Got this kid trying to steal a book, just checking the footage to confirm." The manager raised an eyebrow. "Did you see him steal it?" Frank hesitated, his bravado slipping. "Not exactly, but he was holding it near the exit, and I—" "Enough," the manager said, cutting him off with a wave of her hand. She turned to Keanu. "And you are—" Keanu gave her a small smile. just someone who doesn't like seeing a kid treated unfairly. The manager frowned, then looked at Trevor. Her expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. "Is this true, kid? Were you trying to steal it?" "No, ma'am," Trevor said quickly. "I wasn't stealing, I swear." The manager studied him for a moment, then turned to Frank. "Show me the footage." Frank grumbled under his breath but complied, replaying the scene. The room fell silent as they all watched the grainy video of Trevor standing near the exit, the book in his hand. The footage clearly showed him hesitating, glancing around nervously, then turning back toward the aisles, right before Frank had appeared. The manager straightened, crossing her arms. "Looks to me like he was going back to put the book away." Frank's face flushed red as the manager's words hung in the air. "But he was acting suspicious," he muttered defensively. "Kids like him, they always—" He trailed off, realizing his words were doing more harm than good. Keanu stepped forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Kids like him?" he repeated, his dark eyes boring into Frank's. "You mean kids who come from less, who might not have the money to buy everything they want? Or do you mean kids who remind you of something you don't want to see in yourself?" The room was silent. Even the manager seemed taken aback by the pointed question. Frank stammered, struggling to respond, but Keanu didn't give him the chance. "So let me ask you something, Frank. When was the last time you asked yourself why a kid might be holding onto a book like it's the most valuable thing in the world? Do you think it's because he's plotting to steal it? Or maybe, just maybe, it's because that book means something to him? A chance to escape, to learn, to dream?" Trevor's head snapped up. For the first time, he felt seen. Not as a troublemaker or a kid who didn't belong, but as someone whose struggles and dreams mattered. Frank folded his arms, trying to hold his ground. "Look, I was just doing my job." "No, Frank," the manager cut in, her voice firm. "Your job is to protect this store and its customers, not to make snap judgments and humiliate people without evidence." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but the manager silenced him with a sharp glare. She turned to Trevor, her tone softening. "I'm sorry this happened, young man. It's clear now you weren't trying to steal anything." Trevor nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." The tension in the room began to dissipate, but Keanu wasn't done yet. He turned to the manager, his tone thoughtful but resolute. "I appreciate you stepping in, but this isn't just about an apology. This is about how we treat people, especially those who might already feel like the world's against them." The manager frowned slightly, unsure of where he was going with this. "Trevor," Keanu said, turning to the boy, "you love books, don't you?" Trevor nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Keanu smiled gently. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Trevor hesitated, glancing at the floor. I want to be a writer," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "A writer?" Keanu repeated, his smile widening. "That's a big dream. Do you know what kind of courage it takes to dream like that?" Trevor blinked, startled by the question. I don't know. Let me tell you," Keanu said, crouching slightly to meet Trevor's eyes. "It takes a lot of courage, especially when the world is quick to judge you, like today. But you have to hold onto that dream, no matter what." The manager watched the interaction, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding. "Trevor," she said suddenly, "how would you like to help out here after school? We could use someone who loves books to organize the shelves and keep the book section in order." Trevor's eyes widened. "Really? You mean a job?" She nodded. "It wouldn't be much, just a few hours a week, but it could give you some extra money to buy those books you love." Trevor looked at Keanu as if seeking his approval. Keanu grinned. "Sounds like a great opportunity to me." Frank shifted uncomfortably, clearly unhappy with how the situation had turned against him. "You're rewarding him now?" he muttered. The manager shot him a warning look. "Frank, if you have a problem with this, we can discuss your attitude in my office later." Keanu placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder. "You see, Trevor? When people believe in you, doors can open. And when you believe in yourself, nothing can stop you." Trevor's face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase all the fear and humiliation he'd felt earlier. Before leaving, Keanu walked to the counter, picked up the Catcher in the Rye, and handed it to the cashier. "I'll take this," he said, sliding a few bills across the counter. He then handed the book to Trevor. "This one's on me," he said with a wink. "Every writer needs a good book to start with." Trevor's hands trembled as he took the book. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Keanu smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "You don't need to thank me, kid. Just promise me one thing." "Exercise." "What's that?" Trevor asked. "Someday, when you're a famous writer, you'll sign a copy of your book for me." Trevor laughed, a sound filled with genuine joy. "I promise." As Keanu turned to leave, the manager followed him to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for helping the boy, but for reminding all of us what really matters." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes all it takes is one person to show a little kindness. You never know how far it'll go. With that, he stepped out into the night, leaving behind a boy whose life had been forever changed, and a reminder to everyone in the store that even the smallest act of compassion can make a world of difference. The cool night air greeted Keanu as he stepped out of the store, but his mind was still on the events that had just unfolded. He had stood up for people before. Kindness and fairness were principles he lived by, but something about Trevor's situation stuck with him. It wasn't just the boy's obvious love for books or the injustice of the accusation. It was the way Trevor seemed to shrink under the weight of the world, as if he had grown used to being overlooked and underestimated. Keanu paused at the edge of the parking lot, glancing back at the store through the glass doors. Inside, he could see Trevor speaking with the manager, a shy but hopeful smile on his face. It was a small victory, but Keanu knew it was just the beginning. As he started walking toward his car, the sound of hurried footsteps behind him made him stop. "Mr." Keanu turned to see Trevor running toward him, the paperback clutched tightly in his hand. His breath was uneven and his cheeks were flushed, but his eyes were alight with determination. "Hey, Trevor," Keanu said, his voice warm. "What's up?" Trevor hesitated, his grip tightening on the book. I wanted to say thank you again for everything." Keanu smiled. "You already thanked me, remember? Twice, if I'm counting right." Trevor shook his head. "It's not enough. You don't understand. No one's ever stood up for me like that before. Not at school, not..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the ground. Keanu waited patiently, letting the boy find his words. "My mom," Trevor finally continued, his voice quieter now. "She works so hard, but we barely get by. People like that security guard. They always think the worst of me. And most of the time, I can just ignore it. But tonight, I really thought..." He stopped, swallowing hard as his voice cracked. "I thought no one would believe me." Keanu crouched slightly so he could meet Trevor's eyes. "I believed you, Trevor, because I saw the truth in you, and you should believe in yourself too. Don't let people like Frank decide who you are." Trevor nodded, wiping at his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. "I'll try." Keanu smiled again, his expression thoughtful. "Tell you what, if you're serious about wanting to be a writer, let me help you get started. Do you have a notebook, somewhere you can write down your ideas?" Trevor shook his head. "Not really. I just use scraps of paper or whatever I can find." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, its leather cover worn but elegant. "Here," he said, holding it out to Trevor. The boy hesitated, his eyes wide. "I can't take that. It's yours." Keanu nodded. "It was mine, but now it's yours. Think of it as an investment in your future. Fill it with stories, ideas, anything that inspires you." Trevor took the notebook with trembling hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I promise I'll make good use of it." Keanu straightened, resting a hand on Trevor's shoulder. "I know you will. And remember, Trevor, the world can be tough, but there are always people who'll have your back. You just have to find them. And sometimes, you have to be that person for someone else." Trevor nodded, his grip tightening on the notebook. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his dream wasn't so impossible after all. As Trevor turned to head back to the store, Keanu watched him go, a small smile on his face. The moment was quiet, but profound. Trevor had found a spark of hope, and Keanu knew that spark could grow into something incredible if nurtured. Keanu slid into his car and started the engine, but before driving off, he glanced at the store one last time. Through the window, he saw Trevor showing the notebook to the manager, his face lit with excitement. The next day, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting golden hues across the city, Keanu found himself standing outside the supermarket once more. But this time, he wasn't there for groceries. Something about Trevor had stayed with him, an inexplicable pull to make sure the boy was truly doing okay. Inside, the store buzzed with its usual evening crowd. Keanu spotted Trevor near the back of the store, diligently stacking books in the small book section. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if each book he touched was a treasure. The manager, who had taken a liking to Trevor after the events of the previous night, stood nearby, giving him pointers on how to arrange the display. Keanu stayed at a distance, not wanting to interrupt, but as he watched Trevor work, he noticed something troubling. Frank, the security guard, stood a few aisles away, glaring at the boy with thinly veiled disdain. His arms were crossed, and his posture radiated hostility. Keanu's jaw tightened. He had hoped that Frank might have learned something from the events of the night before, but it seemed that old habits died hard. Keanu stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding, and approached the manager first. "Good evening," Keanu said with a friendly smile, nodding toward the bookshelves. "Looks like Trevor's doing a great job." The manager returned the smile. "He's a natural. Honestly, I wasn't sure about hiring him at first, but he's been great with the customers and the books. I'm glad we gave him a chance." Keanu glanced toward Frank, who quickly looked away, pretending to focus on something else. "Not everyone seems thrilled about it," Keanu said lightly, but his tone carried an edge. The manager sighed. "Frank's a work in progress. I spoke to him this morning about last night, but it's hard to change someone's attitude overnight." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if he steps out of line again, I'm sure you'll handle it, right?" The manager's eyes narrowed slightly, understanding the unspoken weight behind Keanu's words. "Absolutely." Satisfied, Keanu walked over to Trevor, who was now kneeling on the floor, arranging the lower shelves. The boy looked up as Keanu approached, his face lighting up with a grin. "Mr. Reeves!" Trevor exclaimed, quickly standing. "Hey, Trevor," Keanu said, returning the smile. "How's your first day going?" Trevor wiped his hands on his jeans, his excitement evident. "It's great! I've been organizing the books, and the manager even let me recommend some new titles for next week. She said I have a good eye for what people might like." "That's fantastic," Keanu said, his voice warm. "I'm proud of you." Trevor beamed, the weight of the previous night's ordeal seemingly a distant memory. But then, as if remembering something, his expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about what you said," Trevor began, his voice quieter now, "about believing in myself and standing up for others. I want to do that. I want to help people, just like you helped me." Keanu's smile softened. "That's a good goal, Trevor, and it starts with the small things, like treating people with kindness, even when it's hard. You've already taken the first step by being here and showing everyone what you're capable of." Trevor nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. Before Keanu could say more, there was a sudden commotion near the front of the store. Raised voices echoed through the aisles, drawing the attention of customers and employees alike. Keanu and Trevor exchanged a glance before heading toward the source of the noise. Near the checkout counters, a man in a business suit was angrily berating a cashier, slamming his hand on the counter as the young employee, a girl no older than 18, looked on the verge of tears. "This is unacceptable," the man shouted. "You charged me twice for the same item. Do you even know how to do your job?" The girl stammered an apology, her hands shaking as she tried to adjust the register. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean." "Sorry isn't good enough," the man barked. "Get me your manager." Keanu stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Hey, take it easy," he said calmly. "She's trying to help you." The man turned, his expression twisted with frustration. "And who are you to tell me how to handle this? Mind your own business." Keanu didn't flinch. "I'm someone who doesn't stand by while people are mistreated. If there's an issue, let her fix it. Yelling isn't going to help." The man sneered, but seemed to hesitate under Keanu's steady gaze. Before he could respond, the manager arrived, quickly taking control of the situation. As the tension eased and the man begrudgingly accepted the correction on his receipt, Keanu turned to Trevor, who had watched the exchange in awe. "See? Keanu said quietly. Standing up for others doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes, it's as simple as speaking up when you know something's wrong. Trevor nodded, his admiration for Keanu growing even stronger. I'll remember that. Keanu smiled, ruffling Trevor's hair. Good. Now, get back to those books. I'll be checking on you to make sure you're doing your job right. Trevor laughed, the sound light and carefree. As Keanu left the store, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just helped Trevor find justice. He'd planted a seed of kindness and courage that would grow far beyond this small moment. Several weeks had passed since the night Keanu intervened at the supermarket. The air in the city had turned crisp, hinting at the arrival of autumn. Keanu, walking down the same street where the store was located, decided to stop by and see how Trevor was doing. As he stepped through the sliding glass doors, the familiar hum of shoppers greeted him. Near the book section, he spotted Trevor, now wearing a neat store uniform and working with quiet confidence. He was helping a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, choose a book. Trevor crouched to her level, holding up a colorful cover and explaining its story with such enthusiasm that the girl's face lit up with excitement. The scene made Keanu smile. He waited until Trevor finished helping the girl, who dashed off happily to her mother with the book in hand. Only then did Trevor notice Keanu and break into a grin. "Mr. Reeves, hi!" Trevor hurried over, the same notebook Keanu had given him now tucked neatly into his apron pocket, its edges slightly worn. "Hey, Trevor," Keanu said, clapping him on the shoulder. "How's life treating you?" Trevor's face glowed with pride. "Really good. I've been working a lot, and the manager said I might get more hours soon, and, well," he hesitated, pulling the notebook out of his pocket. "I've been writing, just like you told me to. Do you want to see?" Keanu raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Of course." Trevor opened the notebook to a page filled with small, neat handwriting. Keanu scanned the words, his eyes lighting up as he read a vivid description of a boy who dreams of becoming a writer but struggles against all odds. "This is great, Trevor," Keanu said sincerely. "Your words have heart. They're real. You've got talent." Trevor flushed with pride, his confidence blooming. "I'm trying to write a whole story. It's about a boy who doesn't give up, even when everything feels impossible. Kind of like me," Keanu grinned. "Sounds like a story worth telling. And you know what? I think people are going to want to read it someday." The boy's eyes shimmered with emotion, but before he could respond, the store manager approached. She greeted Keanu warmly and said, "Trevor's been a fantastic addition to the team. Customers love him, and he's been doing a great job with the book section." "That doesn't surprise me," Keanu said, giving Trevor a proud look. The manager continued, "Actually, there's something you should know. After the incident that night, we decided to expand our outreach to the community. We've started a program where local kids can come in after school to read or join writing workshops. Trevor's been helping organize it, and the response has been amazing." Keanu's smile grew wider. "That's incredible. I'm glad Trevor's getting to make a difference." Trevor, embarrassed but pleased, looked down at his notebook. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu knelt slightly so he could meet Trevor's eyes. "You did this, Trevor. All I did was remind you of the strength you already had. Keep writing, keep dreaming, and keep being the kind of person who stands up for what's right." Trevor nodded firmly, his smile spreading across his face. As Keanu left the store, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Life would continue to challenge Trevor, just as it challenged everyone. But Keanu knew the boy had found something powerful within himself, a resilience that would carry him far. Outside, Keanu paused to look back at the store, watching through the window as Trevor helped another customer. With a small, knowing smile, Keanu whispered to himself, "Yeah, he's going to be just fine." And as the city moved on around him, Keanu walked away, leaving behind not just a boy with a notebook, but a spark of hope and inspiration that would light the way for years to come. A year later, Keanu sat on the balcony of his modest Los Angeles home, the warm glow of the evening sun casting golden hues across the city. A cup of tea rested in his hand as he flipped through his mail, pausing when a neatly handwritten envelope caught his attention. The return address was familiar. Opening it, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small book. The paper was a letter, written in Trevor's unmistakable handwriting. Dear Mr. Reeves, I don't know if you remember me, but I'll never forget you. Because of you, I found the courage to keep dreaming, to keep writing. I wanted to send you a copy of my first short story, which won a local competition last month. They even published it in this collection. It's dedicated to you, my first hero. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Sincerely, Trevor. Keanu set the letter down, his gaze softening as he picked up the small book. Inside was Trevor's story, with a dedication on the first page. For those who see the good in others even when the world doesn't. Keanu smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. One small act of kindness, he thought, really could change a life, and sometimes the world.